Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to HR for Growing Businesses. Today's session will be a crash course in HR fundamentals, highlighting some of the top of mind considerations for founders and small business owners. I'm Moses Balian, Certified HR Consulting Manager at Justworks. Justworks is a PEO, professional employer organization, that offers payroll services, access to enterprise-level benefits at group rates, tax and compliance support, and HR advisory services. All of this helps our customers grow with confidence. Few housekeeping items before we get started. Your audio is muted by default so that we avoid feedback. Questions. Now this is exciting. This session is pre-recorded, so the non-time traveling version of me is actually going to be monitoring chat and Q&A right now during the session. I will also host a live video Q&A in a separate session immediately following this presentation. Lastly, the webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to registrants by email. Our quick disclaimer, this material has been prepared for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal or tax advice. Setting the scene, what we're going to cover today is especially relevant for those who recently started, just started, or are about to hire their first employees. What if you don't have an HR team, a benefits advisor, a payroll coordinator? Well, what we'll cover today deals with two through lines. The first is staying compliant when hiring and onboarding your first employees. Now, this is going to be a lot of information. It's dry, but fascinating, I think. And above all, super, super important. Feel free to take some notes if you want. Throughout this, we'll be highlighting some common missteps as well. Second, what you can do now for your remote workers, those who are permanently remote and also those who were thrust into remote work amidst the COVID-19 environment. And we'll wrap up with the Q&A. Let's start with onboarding. So one of the fundamental bedrocks of US employment law concerns at-will employment. In every US state except Montana, employment is presumed to be at will, which means that either the employee or the employer may terminate the employment relationship at any time, with or without notice, and for any or no reason. For employers, this generally means that absent a contractual obligation to the contrary, establishing cause is not actually required, nor does that rationale need to be shared with the individual being terminated. In reality, of course, employers generally have some reason for cutting ties with an individual, such as performance, behavior, or business needs. But strictly speaking, cause does not need to be substantiated. At-will employment also means that resigning employees are not legally required to give 2 weeks' notice when they quit. This is merely a common courtesy. There are, however, major limitations to the at-will doctrine, many of which will probably sound familiar to you. We are not going to cover them all, but a big one is that the at-will presumption may be superseded by contract. This sounds obvious, but what's maybe less obvious is that such a contract can be implied by past conduct or other documents, such as an offer letter or handbook that suggests that the employment relationship is not at will. We'll touch on this when we get to employee handbooks. Another limitation that's probably the most familiar to you are the state, local, and federal anti-discrimination and equal employment opportunity laws. This makes it impermissible to discriminate against employees and applicants based on certain protected characteristics. On the federal level, these protected characteristics are age, being 40 and older, disability, genetic information, national origin, race or color, religion, and sex, which now includes gender identity, transgender status, sexual orientation, and sexual harassment. Now, many states and localities, New York, for example, where a lot of our attendees are from, have additional protected characteristics under the law that apply to covered employers. So in New York State, and I'm just going to rattle these off for effect, okay? These include age 18 and older, marital and family status, lawful use of recreational substances, military status or service, observance of the Sabbath, political activities, use of a service dog, prior arrest and criminal conviction, as well as being a survivor of domestic violence. Needless to say, Familiarize yourself with state and local law in all the jurisdictions where you have employees. Okay, time out. I know this is a ton of information. Please don't be overwhelmed. This is really all just to orient you in space, to provide and paint a broad picture of some of the front of mind considerations for founders and small business owners. Now later, when these topics come up in the course of your work, I hope your memory will be triggered and you'll be like, oh yeah, I have to keep such and such in mind. Let me look that up. And now if you have any questions on any of the specific content, please submit in the Q&A via chat or stick around for our live session after the presentation. In line with orientation, offer letters can be an important tool for your company to set forth some basic aspects of the employment relationship like title, compensation, and pay schedule, the basics. Typically, the offer letter will also specify that the employment relationship is at will to ensure that the offer not be construed as a contract like we talked about. Be sure to consult an attorney to make sure your offer letter is appropriately addressing the at will doctrine. Now, when structuring your offer letter, you need to come up with how much you're going to pay the person. It's important to be aware of minimum pay and overtime requirements in your jurisdiction. A common, super common misstep is to misclassify employees as exempt from either state or federal overtime pay requirements, usually 1.5 times the regular rate. Now, there are many different ways that an employee can be exempt from overtime. And there are often differences based on the jurisdiction, but many have 3 core components. A salary basis requirement, which means that the employee has to be paid a salary as opposed to hourly, for example, which does not fluctuate based on the amount of time worked, their output, or the quality of their work. It also involves a minimum salary requirement, which is a number that means the employee must be paid at least a certain amount, a certain salary in order to be exempt. And the duties test, which means that the employee has to perform certain functions in order to be exempt, which I'll talk about. Now, often growing businesses will incorrectly treat all salaried employees as exempt without scrutinizing the other 2 requirements, which can cause major compliance issues and lead to heavy liability. So for example, many companies are not aware that the salary threshold for most of the so-called white-collar exemptions under federal law is $35,568 a year. Far fewer recognize that New York and California have substantially higher thresholds. This is the minimum salary in order for somebody to be exempt from overtime. And even higher thresholds exist in certain occupations, notably for software engineers in California. Growing companies also overlook the duties test a lot. For example, under federal law, under the administrative exemption, employees must have a primary duty that directly relates to the general business operations of the company, and they must exercise independent judgment and discretion with respect to matters of significance. Clear as mud, right? Don't toil on this alone. Consult an HR or legal professional for guidance. At Justworks, our HR consultants, including myself, can help provide you with the tools to make these informed decisions. Next, wage notices are a matter of fact. Many states have wage notice requirements, where either a particular form needs to be provided or certain tenets of the employment relationship need to be communicated in the offer letter to the employee. Moving on to orientation and training. So when I talk about orientation, I mean, welcome to the office. Training is someone getting up to speed over the course of their first 6 months. The 2 common welcome in the door forms are I-9 and W-4. For those unfamiliar with Form I-9, it's what you use to verify a new hire's employment authorization in the United States. All employers must collect and complete I-9s for all employees, including US citizens and non-citizens. It is estimated that about 50% of I-9s contain errors, and if you are audited, the penalties for non-compliance can be steep. Another common mistake is that I-9s are not completed in a timely manner, which must be done within 3 business days of the employee's first day of work. Now, whether in office or amongst your remote workforce, do not overlook orientation and training. A well-designed, engaging, and thoughtful orientation process significantly and positively impacts employee retention in the long run. Orientation is a good opportunity to complete procedural requirements like the I-9s and W-4s, but other new hire forms that might be mandated in your jurisdiction, like a paid sick leave notice in New York, for example, or acknowledgement of what constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace. But don't let your onboarding be weighed down by paperwork. That's very important, but not the fundamental point. The enthusiasm generated from the recruiting process should continue into onboarding. And this is a crucial error that so many organizations make. Companies should be even more enthusiastic about onboarding than the new hire is. So don't lose the momentum you've gained by getting new talent excited to come in the door and accept the opportunity and take on this new challenge. It's a semi-major life event to accept a new job. New hires who you've painstakingly interviewed and selected should be welcomed with energy, investment, and maybe even a little fanfare. Now, make sure employees are set up for success by way of training as well. Training incorporates a lot of things. It might include bringing employees up to speed on the software systems and processes that are specific to your company. It also might include on-the-job skill building. Keep in mind that a growing number of states are also requiring new hires to complete sexual harassment training. But in any event, it is a best practice to also train all employees on anti-harassment and discrimination and other compliance areas like IT security and topics depending on your business. Regardless, take some time in a group or individual setting to learn the ropes. Carve out some space to ask new hires questions and consider establishing formalized mentorship relationships outside of reporting lines between new folks and veterans. I can't speak more highly of mentorship programs that to make an employee feel more comfortable in the role and prepare them for growth opportunities within the organization. Finally, orientation should provide a brief introduction to your company's mission, history, and values, which we will get into shortly. Now, compensation and payroll. We talked about like minimum pay requirements, the compliance aspect of compensation, but now I want to get a bit more into how you make that decision, how you set it in order to attract the right talent. So the most typical benchmarking strategy involves purchasing compensation survey data, actually. You might want to tap into your professional network and see what similar talent is being paid, both in the startup and in the Fortune 500 landscape. Startups who maybe can't offer as much by way of cash compensation definitely have some room to get creative, and they can create other tangible and intangible benefits. Such tangible benefits might include equity-based compensation, access to a 401k plan, or access to robust ancillary and modern benefits like life insurance, disability insurance, pre-tax commuter benefits, or more lifestyle things like gym reimbursement or subsidized access to fitness programs. Intangible benefits might include things like freedom and autonomy over work output, being a results-oriented work environment and focusing on that rather than time at desk, right? Now with a PEO, which is what Justworks is, you can get access to corporate level benefits at prices you can afford. Basically, we pool everyone together to get great group rates. It's like a Costco of health insurance. As far as geography, you can pricing compensation based on geography across office locations based on local cost of living is common, but the prevailing best practice for permanently remote workers gets a little fuzzier. If an employee would be paid a certain wage for working in your office, but that work can be done effectively remotely, that role might warrant the same or similar compensation, so be careful with geographic differences. Also consider pay equity laws and be sure to consult with your counsel before making pricing decisions purely based on work location. Managing expectations with respect to comp is huge, especially in an environment when funding is a little harder to come by and profitability is gaining favor over growth. It will be important to set compensation expectations up front. Emphasize the value of getting in early, for example, impacting change and being part of the innovations that launch the company to long-term success. I want to move on to some payroll basics. So, quick COVID-related note, if you have employees who are working remotely for an extended period from a state in which they do not normally work, it may trigger obligations under the laws of the remote state. For example, and I'm not going to get into the tax implications. I'm focusing on the employment law. So a great example is California has special overtime laws where you have to make, for hourly employees who get overtime, must make time and a half, not just for hours worked more than 40 in a week, but for any more than 8 in a day. This is an important distinction. If you have employees who are working in California or any other jurisdiction, you have to be aware of that jurisdiction's minimum wage and overtime laws. We recommend consulting an attorney about practical approaches to handling this situation. Again, I'm not talking about tax withholding. That's a whole nother ballgame that dust has yet to settle. Payroll taxes are things beyond pay requirements that will depend based on geography. So they're taxes the employer and employee pay via payroll. Be sure that you engage a payroll provider or a more robust solution that includes payroll in its offerings, like a PEO, to make sure that taxes are being withheld, remitted correctly and timely. Pay frequency is also something we talked about that would be indicated in an offer letter. There's laws that govern these requirements. So crucially, your hourly employees, for example, might be subject to what's called a permissible lag time between the end of the pay period and then its corresponding payday. Now, payroll-only products may not be programmed to prompt you to these requirements. So again, you should have HR advisory and a payroll specialist in tandem with your actual payroll software to help you stay in line. Moving on to employee handbooks. So this is a huge topic. There is so much to cover, so we're just going to scratch the surface. And a good place to start for new businesses is truly with a boilerplate or template version. Might not feel like a great fit for your culture, but for liability reasons, that's often the best way to go. You can get this from your legal counsel or HR services provider. Make sure that it includes state and local requirements based on all the jurisdictions where you have employees, right? And go through it and edit policies that are particular to your organization. So you can get creative, but only in the lighter compliance areas, and work with your attorney to make sure that you're not editing anything that might have terrible consequences. So for example, policies you might customize would include vacation time, your paid parental leave policy, attendance expectations, again, whether it's like 9 to 5 or results oriented, dress code, or even your code of conduct. Some policies that are better left boilerplate, however, are going to be things like equal opportunity and sexual harassment. One thing you'll certainly want to include is the at-will employment provision, to make it clear that the handbook does not supersede the presumption of at-will employment. No matter what, have your employment review the document before publishing it to your employees. Handbooks are important for a number of reasons, but first so that you know what to do in certain situations. They're a playbook. They also make sure that you administer different situations consistently, or similar situations in a similar manner. It also helps employees navigate sensitive situations as well. It's a bit of a playbook for them. They witness something that may be sexual harassment, they can go in the handbook and see what constitutes it, and as far as the mechanism for reporting that, right? Now, some policies might also be required by federal, state, or local law, and common examples of these are paid sick leave, FFCRA in the age of COVID-19, and then sexual harassment training and prevention is another example. These are some that are specifically required by law to be in your handbook rather than common best practices. Now, in the age of COVID, another quick note, you might want to implement some temporary policies for employees as far as setting forth expectations with respect to return to the physical office environment, and covering things like PPE and masks, daily health screenings that might include at-home or in-office temperature checks, and FFCRA. Now, keep in mind that best practices and guidance around COVID are changing a mile a minute, so you'll want to make sure that you're well positioned to pivot quickly and communicate those changes to your team. Lastly, reasonable accommodation. So the question of whether your company is required to provide accommodation under applicable law will depend on an individual's medical condition, among other things. With respect to COVID-19, without getting into it too much, employees in different circumstances may be particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, and they might bring to you a request for accommodation as far as minimizing their risks. Be sure also not to involuntarily exclude any individual or group from a workspace solely based on their vulnerability, actual or perceived, to COVID-19, for example, older workers. While you may have your employees' best intentions in mind, doing so may well violate the law, namely disability and age protection laws. Great, let's move on to some common missteps, which I've peppered throughout, but I want to highlight some of the biggies. So the first is employee termination. Employee termination is rife with mistakes. Whether involuntary or voluntary, the termination process is littered with potential missteps. These are three of the biggest areas. First is final paycheck timing and requirements. So in many states, state law might require that final paychecks are paid to employees sooner than the next regularly scheduled payday. This may come as news to New York employers where next regularly scheduled payday is allowed in all circumstances, but in many states it's not. In Utah, for example, resigning employees can be paid on the next regularly scheduled payday. However, fired employees need to be given their final paycheck within 24 hours. Big difference. In California, for example, notoriously, final paychecks are due on the employee's last day, except where they resign without notice, and final paychecks must be delivered via paper check, unless the employee expressly agrees to direct deposit in writing. Final paychecks are one place where set it and forget it doesn't fly. Vacation payout. So some states require the payout of accrued and unused vacation time upon termination. In other jurisdictions, a use it or lose it provision is allowed. Now, an increasing number of employers have opted for unlimited vacation, which has its own benefits and pitfalls. Benefits are that it emphasizes a results-oriented work environment and not having to pay out unused accrued time. Potential downsides have been discussed ad nauseum, where employees take too little vacation, they don't feel entitled to their bank of days, and some employees might take drastically more or less vacation than their peers. And manager enforcement and approval might vary drastically too. Manager to manager, unlimited vacation within the same company can be a vastly different experience. As far as paperwork and notices, another matter of fact, numerous states have required paperwork that must be served to employees upon resignation or involuntary termination. And these are things around unemployment insurance, COBRA, and other statutory benefits that might be available to unemployed persons. Again, be sure to advise your provider that will advise you as to these required steps. Next, leaves of absence administration. Groan. Can hear that from here. Leaves of absence are notoriously error prone. And for anyone who's administered it before, there's a lot of moving parts. Ones especially prone to errors are those that are unpaid or partially paid. So parental leave tends to be the most complicated of these. And the reason is it involves interplay between numerous employment regulations and sources of wage replacement. An experienced HR advisor will help you make sense of these protections and statutory benefits to which your employees are entitled. And they'll also develop a salary continuation scheme for your company that supports employees' major life decisions and milestones, such as welcoming a new child into the family. Furlough. As ever, but especially now, some private sector employers have encountered furlough. You need to be really careful with furlough, because it does not mean the same thing in all contexts. Most typically, the way it's being thrown around now, it means a non-working, unpaid leave of absence due to economic conditions or budget shortfalls. However, what is not permissible in the private sector is working unpaid furlough, which I see a lot among early stage companies. I see this happen, but you are not the government, and private sector employees must ensure that all employees are paid properly for their work. Remember when the TSA stopped paying all the TSA agents for a while? That's public sector. That cannot be done in the private sector. You must also reduce pay as an alternative to a layoff. If you're going to reduce pay rather than layoff, make sure that you follow state and local requirements with respect to wage notice requirements to inform employees of that change, both when it is reduced and when it gets brought back up to parity. I want to touch on interns really quickly, mostly because interns are employees, okay? And they must be paid at least minimum wage, like employees. Federal, state, and state law govern under what conditions an intern can be unpaid, and they are limited. There are lots of factors that apply, such as whether the work displaces the work of regular employees and the extent to which the internship provides training that would be similar to that which you would find in an educational environment. A lot of people incorrectly assume that intern equals unpaid. And in many cases, the majority of cases, this is not true. There are very specific and strict stipulations as far as what constitutes a legally unpaid intern. To be safe, and also to attract talented and diverse teams, consider offering at least minimum wage, if not quite a bit more, and also to pay overtime compensation where applicable. Employee relations for remote workers. So starting or growing a business will look a lot different this year than it did last year. Here's how to implement these tools in the new world we're living in. And this goes for interns too. For productivity management, the remote work environment, whether one imposed by COVID stay-at-home orders or simply as a matter of course, demands highly engaged managers. Frequent and structured check-ins that detail performance expectations, deliverable timelines, and offer continuous feedback as to overall performance are crucial. Managers of remote workers, who may very well be remote workers themselves, should be trained in coaching methods and structured feedback mechanisms. One commonly used tool that I like is the stop, start, continue model, where in each session, managers give feedback as to what new behavior or output to start, one to discontinue due to inefficacy, and what to continue. With respect to continue, I want to emphasize, don't overlook the importance of positive, specific feedback. Usually when we give feedback, positive feedback tends to be general overall. Good job, Jimmy. Or negative and specific. I really didn't like the way you edited this document. Now, positive, specific feedback helps employees acquaint themselves with their strengths as employees and keeps them from losing diligence in important areas such as attention to detail. The positive reinforcement is important. As far as morale and engagement, all workplaces that have recently gone remote and are struggling with the question of employee engagement and wellness will be well served to make some considerations. One thing, I dare you to go beyond the Zoom happy hours. Encourage your teams to take time, maybe even during the workday, to engage in a common activity. Maybe one employee will coach their teammates through cooking a recipe that's culturally significant to them. Which everyone then individually and separately prepares at home. Or there's free online versions of popular board games like Codenames, Pictionary, and Trivial Pursuit that will foster a sense of camaraderie and teamwork more than casual chit-chat. I've always been a fan of non-alcohol-centric work events to better foster collaboration and camaraderie, and I think now that's more true than ever. Employee mental health is paramount in the remote work environment, but especially in one where going remote was unanticipated. So you need to train your managers to recognize signs that employees might be struggling. For example, they exhibit poor attendance, lower productivity, or sudden changes in hygiene or even sociability, gregariousness. Have you noticed that we all tend to use video conferencing more now? I remember when I used to talk to customers, it was almost always on the phone. And now almost every interaction I have is video. Be conscious of the mental strain that can come with demands of this excessive sociability, especially for individual contributors and especially for introverts. Now, it's a fine line, and managers should take stock of each of their subordinates' engagement, not just productivity. But Zoom and video can be an engagement suck, and make sure that that energy is being used appropriately for work and then for meetings when appropriate. Structure can help a lot here. So for example, maybe each manager has 2 one-on-ones with a report each week. That's what I do with my manager. One is the traditional status report and feedback mechanism, which is manager driven. The other, a holistic check-in driven by the employee. And they can discuss any successes or challenges in their working relationships, as well as their ongoing relationship to the remote workplace and professional development that they'd like to have at the company. In closing, invest in mental health resources for your employees in order that they can seek confidential help and counsel when they need it. For example, employee assistance programs were once a nice to have, but are increasingly viewed as an essential employee benefit. Finally, consider your culture and values as a means of unifying and engaging your remote workforce. For small and growing businesses who haven't yet tackled the culture question, now is really the time to get started, right now. The best cultural identities for businesses tend to be a marriage of mission and values, mission-driven and value-driven culture. Mission-driven cultures tend to be easier, partly because they're top-down. We make the best widgets in Charlotte, North Carolina. Value-driven cultures tend to be trickier, and you can get started by hosting surveys or group interviews with your employees. You can also consider the hiring decisions you've already made. These individuals that were given an invitation to join your mission because of their combination of skills, acumen, and personality traits, what made you want to work with that person? What made you, a founder and hiring managers, choose this individual to come and contribute their time and effort to your organization? Double down on what sets you apart. Is it speed, quality, style, a combination? Once you've got your values nailed down, you can turn them inside out and infuse them into your brand. For example, the best dang dolphin-free tuna melts in town, made to order with a smile. The time you spend on this exercise will pay dividends with respect to employee engagement, informing future hiring decisions, and you might even discover market differentiation strategy in the process. With that, I'm Moses Balian, Certified HR Consulting Manager at Justworks, where we make it easier to start, run, and grow a business by giving entrepreneurs and their teams access to simple software and expert support for payroll, benefits, HR, and compliance. I'll see you in the Q&A. Thank you.